Well, welcome to our study on leadership. We're talking about the master leader, Jesus, and trying to become master leaders ourselves. We're now halfway through. This week, just fair warning, it's going to be a little more theoretical. We're talking about the values of a master leader and the importance of defining our values and living by those values. So it's going to be a little bit more philosophical. Next week is going to be a lot more practical. And just fair warning, it's going to be a little longer than our normal sessions, just because when you start talking about the practices of leadership, there's a lot to say, and hopefully it'll be super helpful for you. But let's jump right in. The reason values are so important is because values create culture, and culture drives the direction of your organization. So I just thought, what are the values of Jesus? If you could do a psychoanalysis of Jesus based upon the gospel text, what would be his top 3 values? Here's what I've come up with. You might use slightly different words, but it'd be pretty hard to argue that these are his primary values. Number 1 is love. Number 2 is mercy, particularly in social justice, kind of a Hebrew word, chesed, that falls in line with that. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the third is inclusion, which sounds contradictory to a man who never traveled outside his own country, that, as far as we know, was not fluent in other languages, spoke a little bit of Greek, but other than that, we don't know that he was super multicultural. He never engaged a Gentile without some kind of a little bit of a stiff arm, an arm's length. So why would we say he was inclusive when his own life, he even said, "I've come for the lost sheep of Israel"? Those 3 values, though, I think characterize who he was. And the values that any person has, any organization has, will determine how they carry out their strategy. So it's not enough to know your identity. Who am I? It's not enough to know your vision, your preferred future. It's not enough to know your mission, how you're going to get there. The values will determine how we carry out our mission. Not just what we're doing in the mission, but how we're doing it based upon our values. So this is kind of an overview of the heartbeat of Jesus with the goal in mind that you'll be able to take not these exact values, but to see how your values will drive the direction of your organization. So, master principle number 8. Now we're just going to start with this. If your followers can't walk with you, then they can't watch you. How do we know what Jesus' values are? In some ways, he spoke them. In fact, in a lot of ways, the first one, he spoke a lot about love. He also spoke quite a bit about mercy, not as much. He didn't speak a lot about inclusion at all. So in these 3 values, you have very verbal to not very verbal. Why? Because values aren't just taught, they're caught. And if people who you are leading don't have an opportunity to walk with you, then they cannot see the value you have carried out. In other words, whatever values you end up with as an organization, the people who are closest to you need to have enough access to you that they can catch you carrying out your values. So putting it on a poster on the wall isn't going to cut it. Does this mean that everyone in your organization has to, be over at your house for dinner? No, obviously not. But the people who are in your circle of influence, so if you are the CEO and you've got some managers around you, all of those people have to have enough access to you in real life situations that they see you model your values. One of the simplest exercises for that is, they call it leadership by stroll, or walking leadership, or drop-in leadership. Different names people will call it, but it's when the leader of an organization just walks through the offices, and the way you treat people, the way you talk to people will model your values. It's also helpful, especially if you're in ministry or really any leadership position, if key leaders accompany you to key events. They're able to observe you. I remember years ago, A man came and he stayed at our house for a while. He was checking out the college where I was teaching. And at the end of the week staying with us, he made a comment that just floored me. He said, "You've taught me so much about marriage." Well, I hadn't talked about marriage all week long. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I learned something that I never knew." I said, "What was that?" And his name was Raimundo Marroquin. Raimundo said, "What I learned was that I don't have to shout at my wife to make a point." And I thought, like, you didn't know that? The value that I lived out with my wife, the tenderness that I had towards her, the kindness and treating her with deference and respect was really a brand new lesson to him. No one had ever shown him that. You, as a leader, because you're a leader, you may have had some advantages in life of a good family, maybe not, but a good family, or some better economics, or some better educational opportunities, or some better cultural opportunities. You don't know what you know that others don't know. And they're going to catch more than you teach them just by being around you. So with that in mind, let's look at Jesus' values. The first one is, above all, love. Now, that sounds even churchy as I say it. So let me clarify what we mean by love. In Jesus' vernacular, love was not a noun, it was a verb. It's what you do, not how you feel. And Jesus' command to love others, this is clarification number two, Jesus' command isn't like, this is right, do it. He's saying, this is what God has done for you, imitate it. Again, watching what God has done for us and then doing that for others, that is love. Third, the Greek word agape, or the Hebrew chesed, which we'll circle back around to in a minute, it really is, it's not about an emotion. It is about unconditional loyalty. I'm going to be loyal to you. I'm going to it's a verb, not a noun. I'm going to do what you need, not say what you need to hear. I'm not going to give you a feeling or the warm fuzzies. I'm going to, like, if you're hungry, I'm going to feed you. If you're naked, I'm going to clothe you. If you don't have a house, I'm going to give you a place to stay. That is the pragmatism of love. Now, here's what's interesting about agape. The Greek word agape, and of course, in English, our word love counts for, well, I like you. Oh, I just love your sweater. Well, no, that's not real love. We use it as love. But in English, love means I like it, I love it, I lust it, I have a family affection for you. All of those different kinds of loves in the Greek language are differentiated. Agape is the word that was used in the New Testament, particularly by John, to describe this unconditional loyalty, this treatment of others, regardless of what they have done, but because of what they need. Now, this is so interesting to me. Prior to John, agape did not mean that. It was kind of a separate word floating out there, kind of meant friendship, kind of meant affection, kind of meant, positive treatment of others, but it didn't have a specific theological meaning that we have given it until John gave it that meaning. In other words, agape only meant agape because it was Jesus who infused it with meaning, and John took the label of agape and put it on it. Of course, Christians have always been in the business of changing the meaning of words. So, because God loved us sacrificially, those who call themselves Christians or followers of Jesus are obligated to love others in the same way. That's the foundation of this value. And this became part of the great command of Jesus. Old Testament, 613 commands, all kind of commands. And twice in Jesus' life, someone came up to me, both times he was a lawyer, go figure, and asked Jesus the question, of all these commands, which is the greatest of the commands? And on one occasion, Jesus answered. That was actually Tuesday before he died on Friday. He gave this answer: love the Lord your God and love your neighbors yourself. Love God, love your neighbor. The first time, though, this was in Luke chapter 15. The lawyer comes up to him, asks him a question, what's the greatest command? And Jesus, knowing that a lawyer would rather talk than listen, said, what do you think? And the lawyer, not Jesus, the lawyer said, the first is to love God, the second is to love your neighbor. Now, a couple things that you're probably aware of this. Loving God comes out of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That verse is the John 3:16 of Judaism. In fact, you know those little phylacteries they tie to their head and to their left arm next to their heart. Inside that little box is a scroll with Deuteronomy 6:4. And maybe you've seen mezuzahs on the side of the doorpost. I always put it at an angle. Inside the mezuzah is a little scroll written by a kosher scribe, and it is Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. It is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, that the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So even though there's lots of Old Testament commands, it's clear the primary command is to love God. The secondary command is like unto it to love your neighbor. Now, you cannot love God except by loving your neighbor. Why? Because love is a verb and not a noun. If it were a noun, I could say, oh, I have this feeling towards God. I feel so close to God. And I'm not making fun of that. That's important. It's valuable. And I hope you have that sense. But to love God as a verb, like, how do you do that? How do you give God a meal when he's hungry? How do you give God a house? He doesn't need one. How do you give God anything? By, and all of you who are parents will understand this, by loving his children. When you give practical care, like pragmatic care for someone that God cares for, boy, that is loving God. And so this lawyer asked a question. Well, who is my neighbor? And there are two Greek words he could have chosen from. I recognize he was probably speaking Aramaic, but the two Greek words the New Testament is in has neighbor as those who are right near me, the closest ones to me, or the ones around me. Now, the lawyer used the word that is closest, like who is I want to draw this circle really, really tightly around me because those are the only person that I'm obligated to love. That's the word he used. Do you think Jesus let him get away with it? Well, yes and no. Because when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, which you recognize is not in the Bible, Good Samaritan is not in the Bible, because there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan among the Jews. But Jesus allows him to use that word and says, I'll tell you who your neighbor is, like the one within arm's length of you. That's who you have to love. But this is the genius of Jesus. He said, I'm going to let you get away with that word. I'm going to let you say that you only have to love those that are within arm's length of you. But you have to take your arms with you. And anyone you could touch is the neighbor that you need to love. The second thing Jesus did with this parable, I think, is so brilliant. Notice the lawyer asked, who is my neighbor? When Jesus concluded the parable, he changed the question. He did not ask, who is my neighbor? He said, who was neighborly? The issue is not who is around you. The issue is, who are you? And if you are neighborly, then you are loving God. Now, this story of Jesus was so impactful that it literally changed human history. Even today, we see vestiges of Jesus' command to love our neighbor everywhere around us. For example, handicapped parking places. Why do we have those? We didn't used to. We have those because Jesus said that you love those who need to be cared for in practical ways. In fact, the British government, they used a minister of finance, minister of education. Well, we do too. Why? Minister is a servant, and a civil servant comes directly from the term of Jesus, that is not, Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And he commanded us to follow suit through the parable of the Good Samaritan. The fact that as a nation we went and rebuilt other nations after World War II comes directly out of this idea of loving our neighbor. And I think we can get behind that. But for Jesus, loving neighbor wasn't enough. The most offensive thing Jesus ever said, I mean, it raised eyebrows and anger, is love your enemies. Remember, love is a verb, not a noun. And so when he said to love your enemies, he was saying, in the Middle East, to practically provide for the needs of potential terrorists. I'm not sure that that would fly in our current cultural climate. And yet, how do we avoid it when Jesus himself modeled it? On the cross, first thing he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if we claim to be followers of Jesus, we want to be master leaders like the master leader. How do we avoid his primary value of loving our enemies? So whether you're building a church, a company, a sports team, or a family, love has to be the hallmark, not the mushy, gooey, emotive love. I'm not against that. In fact, I enjoy it, especially with my wife, none of your business. But that's not what really builds a reputation. It's when you treat even your enemies with respect and dignity. When you love like that, you will build a reputation that will ultimately build your business. Now, that's value number one. Value number two is mercy. Love and mercy are actually interwoven. The Hebrew word chesed, it's fun to say, because I like you're spitting, chesed, is this idea of unmerited favor, of caring for someone. It's a loyalty to his people. God's chesed over Israel was his unconditional loyalty to Israel, and he demands the same from us. It's embedded in a verse, Hosea 6:6. You probably heard it. For I desire steadfast love, chesed, and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. In this sense, chesed can actually be pretty ruthless, because throughout the prophets, there's this driving force to show mercy, and it's seen in Jesus. Twice, Jesus quoted this very passage, Hosea 6:6. Once, when he was at Matthew's house, the tax collector, and the Pharisees, why would you go to a house like that? He's an outsider, he's an enemy. Because of loving your enemies, Jesus said, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, chesed, and not sacrifice. The second time, a few chapters later, Matthew chapter 12, Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6 again. His disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath. They say, why? How dare you pick grain? You're violating the Sabbath. And Jesus said, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, if we were to forget that you're a Christian for just a minute. If you're to psychoanalyze Jesus and you ask what drove him, Hosea 6:6 was a pivotal passage that twice he quotes, probably a lot more than that, but that's all we have recorded. Twice he says, this is my value that drives my life. Now, to put that in perspective, you need to go back to the Old Testament to hear how other wild-haired prophets used this principle. Administer true justice, show mercy, chesed, and compassion. That's Zechariah 7, verse 9. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, chesed, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Micah 6, verse 8. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin. But you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Jesus he's not safe. When he starts talking about mercy, buddy, you better get out of his way, because he can turn not nice in a hurry. There are few things that made Jesus angry. In fact, in all the scriptures, this isn't in your notes, it's just in my heart, so I'm going to share it. There's only 3 times that Jesus lost his temper. Number 1, when he started throwing furniture around in the temple. Number 2, when his disciples said to him, don't let those kids in here. They don't belong here. The third one was in a synagogue. There was a man there with a disease called dropsy. And Jesus asked the people of the synagogue, is it right to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they didn't say a word. And their silence condemned them. And Jesus was furious. You should have been there. All 3 times that Jesus gets angry is because someone God cared about was being pushed out by their rules that kept them in. Jesus doesn't take kindly when the principle, the value of mercy is violated. And so we see all throughout the Gospels, Jesus showing mercy. Can I just machine gun a few of them at you? Here's one. There were blind men 2 times, not once, twice. Blind men pleaded with Jesus, have mercy on us, and they received their sight. A Canaanite woman broke into a home, and not like a thief, but she pushed her way into a Jewish home. That wouldn't go over very well. And she asked for mercy for her demonized daughter. Another man comes to Jesus pleading for his demonized son. He was healed. A Gentile demoniac said to Jesus, let me go with you. A problem, he was a Gentile. It's not right for him to follow into Jewish territory. It would cause a hullabaloo. So Jesus said, go home to your friends and tell them how the Lord has had mercy on you. 10 lepers come up to Jesus. One of them was a Samaritan. They all get healed. He got mercy from Jesus. There's 2 parables of tax collectors. Twice, Jesus says, tax collectors received mercy in these parables because of their faith in God. And the Beatitudes. In fact, it's repeated once in Matthew, once in Luke. Slight variations. Matthew says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Luke says, be merciful even as your Father is merciful. Now, here's where it gets super interesting to me and a little deep theologically. Mercy, as we know it, is not just a verb, but it is actually a noun. The Greek word is heliosterion. Heliosterion. Helia is mercy. Arion is a place. So, like any location, location of a place has this add-on at the end of a Greek word, arion. So the heliosterion is the place of mercy, and it describes the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. Read this word in Hebrews. The lid of the Ark of the Covenant. That's where the high priest sprinkled the blood of the bulls and goats on the Day of Atonement. It's a place where mercy is granted because that's the place where the blood is given. But Romans chapter 3, verse 5 uses that very word, heliosterion, for the person of Jesus. Because he, pinned to the cross, is the place where the blood is shed and the place where mercy is given. So when we're talking about mercy for Jesus as a value, it has to be connected not just to acts of compassion, but the just payment for the crimes committed. It is a legal term where someone receives mercy if the payment is paid for them to receive mercy. And all of Jesus' healings, I know people get pretty excited about, oh, he healed people and are blind and lame and wonderful miracles. Listen, the miracle of Jesus' healings is in the heliosterion. The reason they were able to be healed physically is because the payment for their sin would be paid through Jesus. And that impacts us as leaders, that we understand, we who are master leaders, following in the example of Jesus, we know the mercy we have received by the blood atonement of Jesus. It is that kind of sacrifice that compels us to show not just love and compassion, that's agape, that's compassion, but mercy. When we understand that the people who need mercy most are least likely to get it. And if you're a pastor, then you understand sharing forgiveness with people who are ex-whatever, ex-cons, ex-ez, ex-addicts, because the penalty has been paid. But if you're a businessman and you have a business and you can hire people who are exes of anything, that we all have history, we all have a past, we understand that the penalty has been paid and we are able to bring social justice to someone who has been on the other side of justice. That's when the value of Jesus as a leader is fully expressed. So it leads me to this master principle number 9. Master leaders lay down their lives for their followers. And if Jesus was willing to be the heliasterion, the place of mercy, then our leadership compels us to be a place where mercy is seen. So whether you're a coach or a parent or a teacher or a CEO or a CFO, mercy in practical terms of social justice is a powerful value of Jesus. The third value of Jesus is inclusion, and it follows on the heels of mercy, of the heliasterion. We begin with the compassion of love, we go to the social justice of mercy, and then we go to the social idea of inclusion. Now this is not because we are such nice people and we just love everybody. No, it's that we love God. And the idea of inclusion for Jesus, though Jesus never went outside of Israel, though Jesus never invited Gentiles in. In fact, even the Gentiles who came to him, he kind of stiff-armed them a little bit. Made sure they had faith, made sure they understood that he was the Jewish Messiah. He said, I've come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And yet there's something underlying the ministry of Jesus that makes it outward focused. And it is the prophets that predicted that Yahweh was the God of all of the earth. Isaiah 42:6, I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations. Again, Isaiah 49:6, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Israel and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. And this is reflected in Jesus' own parables, Matthew 13:47. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. Let's be clear. We are inclusive, not because we're celebrating diversity, but because we are worshiping God. And the God of the universe, when time gives way to eternity, and the nations and tongues and tribes stand before him, if there is any language missing, then the praise that God deserves is minimized. If there's any dance missing, any culture or any dress or any language missing from that mix, then God is not getting all of the praise that he deserves. Our job as leaders is to bring all people to the throne of God's grace, whether that's through a business, whether that's through a church, through an athletic team, or through a family. Jesus promised that the Gentiles would enter the kingdom, and not just the good ones, but Israel's traditional enemies. This is from Jesus. He said the Ninevites and the Queen of Sheba would get in. He said Sodom and Gomorrah, would get in. He said Tyre and Sidon, enemies of Israel, would get in. That all nations would stand before the judgment seat. Is it any wonder, with Jesus talking like that, is it any wonder that Gentiles kept coming to him asking for a seat at the table? You've got the centurion servant in Matthew 8, the Syrophoenician woman who begged for her daughter, the Gerasene demoniac, the Samaritan leper. Jesus said that the Gentiles, this is an impressive passage, that he had to go to those who were not part of this flock. He's talking about the Gentiles in John chapter 10, verse 16. In fact, even when he cleansed the temple, it was to make room for all nations among the people of God. And the temple actually was not the primary place where Jesus practiced inclusion. It was at the table. Now, for you and me, we go out to dinner to get to know a stranger. They wouldn't do that in the ancient world. Meals were a place that reinforced the boundaries of your family, the boundaries of your economic group, the boundaries of your political affiliation, and your religious group. In fact, Jesus invited to the table the very people who were excluded in ancient Israel. There's a little chart in your notes that describes side by side Luke 4, Luke 14, Leviticus 21, and a passage out of Qumran, that is from Cave 1, Qumran Scroll, SA, chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. It has the exact same categories of people, the blind, the crippled, the lame. Those are the people that Jesus invited to the table. Those are the very people who were excluded from the temple in Leviticus and were excluded from the community of the Qumranites in the Qumran scrolls. Therefore, the very people that others were excluding, Jesus was including at his table. Granted, they were the lame, the blind, the sick of Israel, but that set a trajectory so that Christianity became centrifugal. As a Christian, the practice of Jesus, the commands of Jesus, the lifestyle of Jesus pushes us ever outward. Every other religion that you and I know says if you want to be righteous, you get to the inside. Not Christianity. We are inside out people. That the more righteous you are, the further you go to spread the fame of God all around the world. And for Jesus, the cost was not just going to those who are outside, but excluding those who traditionally, the Pharisees or his own family, would be considered insiders. And all of this culminates in the book of Acts, as you well know, with Cornelius, the first Gentile who came to faith in Jesus Christ, comes out of a vision of Peter at the table where there's a blanket of all kinds of foods spread before him. And he refused to eat unclean foods. And what he realized in the vision is that when God said, stop calling unclean what I've called clean, that we're not talking about food. We're talking about people, languages, nations. And that's why the Great Commission is our first priority. Jesus' last command is our first priority, to go to all the world and make disciples of all nations. As a master leader, that has to be a primary value of inclusion, not because you love those people, because you want God to be praised by all people, languages, tongues, and tribes. So, what do we do with all this to really embed it in our leadership practice? I want to refer you to 3 exercises. One is a book called Start With Why. It's not a Christian book. It's from Simon Sinek. And he has done some actually really fascinating biological studies that in our brain, there's 3 layers. There's the why layer, the how layer, and the what layer. And the what layer is like, what do you do as a business or as a church? What are you doing? That's the outside layer. Everybody sees that. The next layer in your brain, the next layer is how you're doing it. And the deepest layer, in fact, it goes even beyond logic and verbiage. It's the why, the purpose behind it. And what Sinek has noticed is every company with explosive growth starts with a why. Other companies say, here's what we do. We sell computers. Apple doesn't do that. Apple starts with a why. Don't you want life to be beautiful and sleek? How we do this is through our computer, and what we do is we make computers. Companies that tell people what they do, then how they do it, then why they do it, are not as effective as those that start with why. That's why whatever values you come up with as an organization is your starting point for PR and advertising. Your values have to be embedded in the practice and the DNA of the organization and promoted externally. That's exercise number 2. Find yourself a secret shopper, because you think you know what your values are as a church or an organization. You may not. Have someone come in and just experience the service or experience your business, and then walk away and later write down what are the primary values that they value most here. You might be surprised what people's perceptions are. Your values are not what you say. It's what people see. So the third exercise then is to gather a group of people together, your think tank specialist, and identify if the secret shopper does not correctly identify your values, then identify what your values really are, and then begin to wordsmith them in a way that are bumper sticker sticky. that you can just put them on a poster on the wall, put them in places that are visible. If you're a church, even preach through them so people know that you keep coming back over and over and over again to these values. You cannot over-communicate your values because your values will drive the direction of your organization. Listen, Jesus' values are a good place to start. You may have a few more or articulate them a little bit differently. Don't just copy these three, but understand the importance of identifying your values as an organization, wordsmithing them in a way that is marketable, and then promoting them perpetually so that every person, like if you walked up to any person in your church, any person in your business, any person on your team and said, what's our values? What's our values? They would be able to tick them off one by one and then catch you living them, because that's the only way that they will be most deeply embedded in the organization. Hey, God bless you on your journey to becoming a master leader.